Hello everybody and welcome back to another Blender tutorial, except today we have a special episode, hey there, because I actually have a looking glass. If you don't know what this is, it's actually the only consumer grade hologram on the market as far as I know, and you can see it actually has parallax and you can see your stuff in 3D. So what you see in here is updated here. So for example, if I was to go to kind of solid mode and maybe add in a cube and like move it, I don't know, move it towards the camera, if I'm able to do that, you can see it's now in the looking glass with perspective and all this. So in this tutorial, we're going to talk about not only how to generate this effect, but how to get it on a looking glass. Before we begin, you're going to need two things to actually get this running, and you can find this on the Looking Glass website. You need the Looking Glass bridge, which is what lets your computer talk to the thing, and second of all, you're going to need the Blender add-on, which is going to send you to a GitHub page, and you are going to install that. This isn't an installation tutorial, this is just about how to make this effect, and a cool little trick where we send it to the looking glass. So let's get started. The first thing we are going to do is in Blender, we are going to open up the Looking Glass add-on. Again, this is something you're going to install. It's actually weird. It's called Alice Looking Glass, so make sure you install that. You're going to see we have this tab over here, and we are going to click this button, which is going to sync our scene to the looking glass, and you have to set a camera. So you can see right now, the looking glass is blank. We don't see anything. The reason for this is this camera is showing, one, our focal plane, but two, our like near and far distance of what it can see. What does this mean? This means if I increase the bounds to include this cube, so I'm just changing my clip start and end, and also moving my focal plane to where you want this to be in focus, you can see now it's actually showing the viewport. Which is really cool. We actually have two settings for this. We could either show the viewport or we can show what's called the quilt render, which you can think of as a 3D render. I'm showing the viewport with automatic update, so anytime I change something, so let's say I was to go into here and do some insetting and some extruding, you can see it's actually updated here live is the idea. I'm going to rotate the object, and then in a second, you will see that it's rotated here. So that is the core idea. Now what we want to do is we want to make the effect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the camera somewhere that's actually nice for us, and that's going to be, let's say it's down the x-axis, and we'll tilt it so it looks forwards, and also tilt it by 90 degrees. So this is basically our looking glass window. And I'm just going to set it, so we have to do a couple extra things that we wouldn't have to do in a normal thing. I just need to set the focal plane and all this. So now we're focused on the middle over here. So again, if I was to add in an object like a cube, you can see it's showing in a very 3D sense. Look at that, you can see the edges of it when you rotate it. Okay. Let's get into the actual tutorial. So in Geometry Nodes, we're going to turn this into a GeoNodes object, and I'm going to make this into a... actually, we're going to keep it as a cube. Kind of counterintuitive. We're going to start off with a cube, and let me just get into the camera view. Again, this also works with Geometry Nodes. I know I'm kind of harping on this, but whatever. We're going to start off with a cube, and I'm going to subdivide it, or subdivision surface it, so it kind of looks like a sphere. But it actually has the geometry of a kind of rounded sphere without any poles, okay? So the reason we're doing this is we're going to extend a bunch of tentacles out of this and animate them over time. So what I can do is, now that we have this mesh, is we can extrude mesh based on the vertices, and you can see that creates all these tentacles that we can control kind of the span of. And at obligatory, you can see that it's actually updating here. And what I want to do with this is I want to take these edges we've created, basically these tentacles, and turn them into curves so we can actually control them. So what we are going to do is we are going to separate the geometry. Separate geometry, make this the side selection, and set this to edge. And now you can see we can either select these new edges, or if I actually switch these, or the sphere. So we can alternate between them. For this, what we are going to do is we are going to do mesh to curve, so we actually have curve information, and now we can do some fun stuff. So for example, we can give this thickness, so curve to mesh, so I'm going from mesh to curve to mesh, you get the idea, and I'm going to set a profile curve as a circle, and bring down the radius, and also the amount of geometry. So you can see, now we get the spiky looking thing, and again, you can see it in the hologram. You get the idea. I want to now give this kind of a custom radius, so it's kind of pinching at the tip so we don't have this open thing. Point is, add a set curve radius node. We are going to make this based on the spline parameter, so as we go along the spline, you can see it's kind of going the other way. It's pinching at the center and then expanding at the bottom. So what I can do is I can send this through an RGB curves, through the color input, and we can just reverse this. So you can see now it's going to be big in the beginning and pinching down here. We can also add some curvature to this to make it more interesting, although you can see it's not actually updating on the viewport because we don't have enough geometry in our curve. So I'm going to resample the curve, give it like 30 points, and you can see now we get a more interesting kind of look to this. So there we go. We have tentacles. Let's randomize it a bit. So I'm going to math multiply this by a random value, which you can see creates kind of like this very blobular looking thing because at each point it's randomizing the radius. I want to evaluate this per curve, so each curve gets its own random number. It turns out there's a node for this, evaluate on domain, set this to spline, and now each spline has its own kind of radius. So I'm just going to increase the average over here. And again, you can see it's three-dimensional. Yay! Now let's actually have this thing distort and have that happen over time so it looks more interesting. So what we can do is we can take our curve and we are going to modify the position. So we're going to set position by a random amount, and we can use a noise texture for this. You can see it kind of creates this blob. First thing we got to do is we got to center this. So I'm going to subtract by an average of 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, which is going to center this. And you can see it kind of looks like a mess over here, but we're going to fix that. So we want to control the size of this effect, so we can set this to scale and make this also a function of the spline parameter. Okay, take that and let's multiply this effect so we can control kind of the scale of it. So you can see now we have nice control over this, and I can bring down the scale of the noise to create this kind of effect. Last thing I want to do is I want to animate this, so I'm actually going to turn this into a one-dimensional input. So it's going to take our index, and we have to bring down the scale accordingly until we get kind of what we want, so maybe 0.06. And now to animate this, we are going to add some index over time, and you can see that actually expands this thing outwards. The reason we're using the index is it increases as we go along the curve, so it actually animates in a kind of continuous way. So I'm just going to subtract the time input, which is going to animate this over time, and let's make this thing a bit faster. So I'm going to multiply it by, let's say, 5, something like that. One other thing we can do that I actually didn't do for mine, but you can do it, is we can trim this curve. So let's add a trim curve. This is just going to randomize kind of the length of this. So you can see we're expanding and shrinking it. We want this to also be by a random value. And let's set this to be between like 0.6 and 1 so that most of these arms are fairly big. And you can see we're getting this nice animation. I do want this to be a bit thicker though. So we are going to multiply this by, make it bigger on average, something like that. And that looks pretty good. I like the look of that. Okay, moving onwards. We now need to give this thing a material, and that's actually going to be pretty easy. And one thing that I'm going to do for this is that we're going to set it up so it works in Eevee, because when we render this into a quilt, which again is a 3D render, it's going to have to do it from a lot of views, so it's going to render again and again and again, and Eevee is better for that. So we're going to set this to be a material, and we need to know kind of which tentacle is which, so I'm also going to make some named attributes for us. So before we turn this into a mesh, we can store named attribute. The first one we can call island, so that's going to tell us which tentacle it's at. And the trick here is we can use mesh island to port over this information. So I'm going to take the mesh island index and divide it by the total count, so it's going to give us a number between 0 and 1 for each tentacle. Connect that in here. And the second thing is I also want to store the length because that could be useful for us. So again, that is going to be the spline parameter. And now we can take this information and port it over to the shader editor. So I'm going to go to the render tab, And let's look at this from the camera view, and let's give this thing a nice material. So you can see the material is linked right now. If we change it, it does that. Let's bring in our attributes. So the first one is called Island, and you can see that it's not working. Apparently I messed something up. Okay, we need to take the store named attribute and bring it after curve to mesh, I believe. That way it's actually storing mesh island geometry. So I need to set this to division, I think, is the final issue that I did here. And there you go, you can see we've randomized it. So many mistakes. Take hue saturation value, connect this to hue and make this to color red, and that's going to randomize the color of each of our tentacles, which you can see is creating this cool looking thing here. We can also add a bit more randomization or a bit more interest by bringing in our other attribute, which hopefully this one works. So I'm going to set this one to length, and you can see it is outputting the length here. So what I want to do is I'm going to connect this to the hue, which should look like the colors changing as we go along this. Perfect. And I'm going to add now a bit of random offset is the idea. So each one has kind of a rainbow gradient, but it's offset by some random number. And let's make that gradient not as intense by multiplying this by like 0.5 or something like that. And I kind of like the look of that. We can improve the look of this even more by making the background bright and increasing the ambient occlusion so we can actually see some shadowing over here. And that really is the essence of the effect. I mean, you can go into materials a bit more, but I think that is a good looking render. Now to get this thing, whatever it is, this tentacle monster, inside our looking glass in high quality instead of this preview quality, what we can do is we can render a quilt. And what this is it's going to be our render from a bunch of different views. So first of all, resolution is set for us. This is the looking glass resolution. And second of all, you want to set a output directory. So I'm going to make this a PNG. Again, it's going to make kind of like a spreadsheet or kind of like a character sheet of PNGs. I'm going to call this quilt render. Accept that, and now all you have to do, it should be as easy as hitting render quilt. And you can see it's rendering this from a bunch of different views, even though we're only rendering a single frame. It needs to make this three-dimensional. So we're going to wait for that to happen. Okay, so you can see it finished our quilt, which really is kind of like a sprite sheet or a character sheet. It's going to use these to basically merge into a 3D thing. To actually view this, we're going to turn this from viewport to quilt viewer, and we're going to open up the quilt that we rendered. So we called it, I guess we could just find it. It's called quilt something or other. There it is. So just open that up, and now you can see it's actually inside our looking glass at high quality. So you can do this with any render. It doesn't matter if it's geometry nodes or whatever. You can do this with an animation even, although you have to render a lot to do that. But you can see, we're getting a cool looking thing. It's our 3D render in a hologram. Isn't that neat? So there you go. That is my experimentation with the looking glass inside of Blender. Of course, there's much more you can do in here. You can do this as your live viewport and put your renders in here, etc. Last thing I want to say is if you want to get one for yourself at not full price, you can get it for $40 or $45 off by clicking the link in the description, which is quite a bit of money off. So consider it.